Hello again, everybody out there in Azure Stack land. It's Pat Telford, one of the technical leads for the Azure Stack Early Adoption Initiative. And I'm coming to you live, or not really live, pre-recorded from the shed out behind my house. And in this section, we're going to talk about Azure Stack in disconnected scenarios. So what do you do to plan for Azure Stack if it's not going to be connected to the internet and online like most deployments are? So we're going to talk about a number of things about systems that you need to have within communication distance of your Azure Stack to make it work. What's different about deployment? What's different about things like registration, certificates, identity, etc. We're going to talk about the backups of a disconnected Azure Stack and how support is different when you're disconnected. So we'll whiz through this at fairly high speed. So the first natural question to ask is, why would you have a disconnected Azure Stack? So there's a few typical scenarios where disconnected Azure Stacks would be deployed. So you might have some security or network topology considerations that would make you have it disconnected. So you don't want it to be connected to the internet at all. Maybe you don't want it to be connected in a network with other unknown computers for security reasons. It's possible you might also want to block data, including usage data, from ever going up to Azure. That's probably a minor niche scenario. And sometimes people want to use Azure Stack just as a private cloud. So if hybrid scenarios are not part of your priority, a disconnected Azure Stack is a reasonable way to go. Now, it's still possible to use a disconnected Azure Stack with hybrid scenarios, but as you'll see when we talk about identity in the disconnected environment, there won't be a shared identity between Azure and Azure Stack. So that might be disadvantageous deployment. So first of all, we're going to talk about identity. The decision to deploy a disconnected Azure Stack impacts your ability to choose what type of identities you'll use in Azure Stack. And it also has an effect on the way that you look at billing. So one thing before we get started on these comparisons is that a disconnected Azure Stack is not a setting in Azure Stack. It's a deployment model. So there's no slider or any configuration in Azure Stack that says, I'm disconnected. So as you'll see when we talk about some of these things, you can make some changes over time if you are disconnected at the start and then you later on get internet access. And each decision has its own little nuances to it. So just keep in mind that it's not a setting. A disconnected is a state or a deployment method that you get into. So as you'll know from some of the previous conversations in this series, there are two possible identity sources for use with Azure Stack. The primary one that we encourage people to adopt is to use Azure Active Directory. So that means that the identity of the operators and the identity of the users that connect to the portal and do stuff comes from an Azure Active Directory tenant. This means it's more usable or more friendly to deploying hybrid solutions where you might want to use that same identity across the parts of the solution that are deployed in Azure Stack and the parts that are deployed in public Azure. The other option is to use ADFS, so to federate with an existing Active Directory somewhere else. And I won't go into the details of each of these, but when you think about connected and disconnected, there are some choices here. So in the connected model, you have your choice of identity. In the disconnected model, you must use Active Directory with Active Directory Federation, because you're assuming there's not going to be connectivity up to Azure Active Directory to use when users connect to the portal or connect up to Azure Stack in other ways. The other question here is, if you're connected, you can have your choice of billing model. You can either pay as you go, that's the consumption model, or you can elect to pay a flat fee based on the size of your Azure Stack instance at the end of each month. That's capacity billing. If you're disconnected, you can only choose the capacity billing model, because in disconnected, we assume that you will not be able to automatically send up data from Azure Stack as consumption occurs to formulate. So the other thing about disconnected is, can you connect just some of the time? And does that leave you in a disconnected state or not? So the thing to remember here is that a connected Azure Stack doesn't have to be continuously connected, but it does need to connect at least once every 30 days. And that's to keep the billing information flowing. The consumption information from Azure Stack must go up to Azure Commerce so that your bill can be calculated for that 30 days. Azure Stack will store up your consumption over time if it can't reach the Azure service for billing. But it does need to connect at least once every 30 days if you're going to be deemed to be connected and you're using the pay-as-you-go consumption. So here's a few examples of realistic scenarios for a disconnected Azure Stack. For a sometimes connected Azure Stack. So the first one is a cruise ship, right? So maybe the Azure Stack is on board the ship, it goes out to sea, it might not always have internet connectivity, but it will come back into port and then it will be able to be well connected and sync up. The other primary case for a sometimes connected Azure Stack is like a mobile deployment. So a military or exploration or something where the Azure Stack is probably ruggedized, portable, taken out into the field where it does some duty. It might be connected to devices like IoT or exploration devices or telemetry or feedback, and then it's returned to a better connected location. So again, this could be a sometimes connected scenario as long as it comes back to home base at least once every 30 days. And the other one is disaster relief. Disaster relief is hopefully a short-lived activity. So you might be able to deploy an Azure Stack with a bunch of workloads into a disaster hit location. Again, it would be deployed there temporarily and then maybe brought back to a well-connected place to sync up, to publish information, and to help with the disaster recovery. So those are some examples of sometimes connected scenarios. In all of these scenarios, you could also choose to deploy a fully disconnected Azure Stack. And then you wouldn't have the requirement to bring it back and connect it up every once in a while. Now, if you're only sometimes connected, it doesn't make sense to use Azure Active Directory as your identity source. Because while it's disconnected, if you ever need to connect to the portal to do anything, to set anything up, to create a new VM, to manage the Azure Stack, if you're not connected, you would not be able to log on with your Azure AD account. So if it's sometimes connected, you're probably still going to use the ADFS model for identity, but you may choose the consumption model for billing. When you're disconnected, you still need to have some other systems. Azure Stack doesn't really work very well just by itself. There are some other things that you would like to connect to. So I'm going to go through a few of the models for adjacent systems, what you might need to have sitting next to your Azure Stack if it's disconnected. So in a normal minimal deployment, you have your Azure Stack. So that's the picture we've got here with the racked servers, and the router on top is the connectivity out from Azure Stack. So in order to operate properly, you can't just have your scale unit of Azure Stack. You will be connected up to a border router. So that's the router in the data center, or however you're going to get out to have access to devices on the wider network. And that would be connected to the top of rack switches in your Azure Stack instance. If you're using ADFS as your identity source, which you likely will be, you would need to have access to another external Active Directory, because that's where all the real user accounts are going to sit, and you will federate with that. So you'll choose in your setup parameters the Active Directory name that you would like to federate with. So it's going to be sitting out there somewhere accessible to the Azure Stack scale unit. ADFS needs to be set up on that Active Directory. You will also need to have certificates, so it would make sense to have some sort of CA sitting out there somewhere that can sit as part of your Active Directory. It could also be another separate standalone CA that's issuing certificates, but it needs to be accessible. And then obviously the users are going to need to have some way to access Azure Stack. So they'll be sat out there on your larger network, connecting up to Azure Stack through the border router. If you're connecting to devices like IoT devices, they'll be sat out there near where the users would normally sit. So this is a good example of a small scale Azure Stack topology. This is sort of the minimal set of things that you would want to connect. Normal scenario. Now, some of the OEM vendors understand this model. They understand that you're going to need to connect adjacent systems. So here's an example of a solution that is already sort of planned and pre-architected by one of the OEMs in their service organization. So what they do is they have their Azure Stack scale unit with the two top of rack switches. I've shown them there's two routers. And then right in front of them, they connect up some firewall devices. So these are firewall devices sitting in rack right alongside the Azure Stack instance, and they sit between the top rack switches and the border routers that connect you to the general infrastructure. They also include another pair of servers. So again, all of this stuff is in rack. Those two servers are in rack. So the firewall devices give you better isolation of your Azure Stack. That's all built in. And then these two other servers are sort of jump servers. They each have a number of services that you'd want to service your Azure Stack. So they can hold your Active Directory domain services and ADFS. They can hold certificate services running on top of AD, so AD certificate services, and DNS and network time. So basically that's all the services that you might want, but it's all sitting in rack in those two bonus servers. And they're redundant, so those services delivered via Active Directory are distributed across the two servers. So if one goes down, you still have resilience. And you can see they're cross-connected to the two firewalls, and the two firewalls are cross-connected to the top rack switches. After that, the routing goes out to the border router and then into the internal infrastructure if it's needed. So all of that stuff inside the gray line is inside the rack with Azure Stack. And this will be OEM specific, although you can imagine you can architect this type of solution with any of the OEM's hardware yourself. So we talked about adjacent systems. There may be some other things that you want to deploy other than just the basic Active Directory users and input devices. So you might want to hook up to an existing monitoring system. Even if you're disconnected, it might be a large disconnected environment that has monitoring systems built into it. So that's monitoring, as we've talked about in one of the other modules. You might also have management for patching, etc. So that could be a system-centered configuration manager sitting on an accessible place of this disconnected network. That could also run as a virtual machine in IaaS inside Azure Stack. So not all of these services would need to be external. It's possible to run some of them as VMs running on the Azure Stack itself. So you can consider that if you're architecting one of these disconnected scenarios. Backups, we obviously recommend that the backup for infrastructure or workloads should be independent of Azure Stack. So if there's a disaster in the rack, you'll have a backup held somewhere external to it. And so that can be either the backup service to backup IaaS VM workloads, other workloads in the user space, and can also hold the shared folder required for infrastructure backups that you'd schedule automatically inside Azure Stack. The other things that you'd normally deploy are DNS, NTP, and you need access to the certificate revocation list. So those things can run quite happily over on the Active Directory side. Now, we also are developing a pattern for a mobile Azure Stack. So this is a really, really minimal solution. So no border routers involved in here at all. Just the Azure Stack with its top of rack switches. And there are some ports that are earmarked on that switch as spares that can be used to connect up to other things, undefined things. Normally all the ports on the top of rack switches have well-defined functions so that they can be identically cabled for every Azure Stack deployment, but there are some spare ports. There's 4 spare ports sitting up there. So it's possible that you could connect up some devices to talk to Azure Stack. Maybe that's a set of small number of IoT devices. They can use those 4 ports, and they can use the IP addresses associated with those ports. You'd probably also want a backup share to be sat off there somewhere, so maybe just a small NAS device or something. Now, in this case, there's no external source for identity. So as you've probably seen in some of the other exercises, inside of Azure Stack, there's a secret inside the black box instance of Active Directory with ADFS. That's used to power all the service accounts for the virtual machines that are used in the fabric of Azure Stack, but it's not used for real user IDs. But you'll know if you've ever managed or done troubleshooting or deployed in Azure Stack that there's an account called Cloud Admin. So if you ever have to use the break glass procedure and connect up, you're going to log on with that Cloud Admin. It's guaranteed to be there because it's internal to Azure Stack, even if you lose all network connectivity. So it's possible in some minimal scenarios like this that you could get by with only using Cloud Admin type accounts from the local Azure Stack. So that's a very unusual scenario. So this would really be, you probably don't have any users connecting up to your Azure Stack. You just have some devices or something else that are being used to expose the workloads running in your Azure Stack. So you can create some additional Cloud Admin users. You're going to connect to the privileged endpoint, the PEP. You're going to log on with your current Cloud Admin account, and then you're going to run the command new-cloud admin user to basically create a clone of that account. So the services that are connecting in from those input devices there, they could use that credential to connect and do stuff. So this is you have to do some really detailed thinking and planning and engineering if your solution looks like this, but this might be like the ruggedized Azure Stack with a few devices bristling out from it that you might see in the back of a truck that's zooming around and truly mobile. So it doesn't have all of that extra overhead of additional infrastructure. In the case where you're deploying this, you would answer the Azure Stack questions for pre-deployment as if it was going to connect up to an ADFS, because you can pre-stage that connection without the ADFS, the external ADFS being there. So this Azure Stack would be set up as if it were going to use ADFS, but the ADFS never showed up. So you're going to have to use those internal accounts. So this is just a oddball, very extreme example of a disconnected Azure Stack. So if you're disconnected, what doesn't work? Or what works differently? I'm going to go through this list pretty quickly. You'll be able to see it on the screen. I might skip over a few of the items. So multi-tenancy. Multi-tenancy requires Azure Active Directory. If you're connected to an ADFS, you can only connect to one Active Directory forest outside of Azure AD. So that's a limit of the identity choice, not so much about being disconnected. The desired state configuration extension for virtual machines, it looks out to the internet for some of the latest content for the Windows Management Foundation. Normally, DSC will have the most current WMF, or your VMs will have the most current versions of WMF installed in them, so this probably won't be a problem. The same thing is sort of true for Docker. Docker checks the internet to see if the latest version is available, and that check will fail. The documentation in Azure Stack pulls content from online, so some of the help links won't work if you're disconnected and have no internet access. And most of these, you can see they're not a problem with being in a disconnected configuration. They're a problem with not having internet access. So you may be deploying a disconnected Azure Stack and you still have internet access, in which case a lot of these things will still work just fine. The alerts that pop up in Azure Stack from the health resource provider, a lot of them have links that'll point to an online location for how to remediate the problem. So obviously, if you can't see the internet, those links aren't going to work. So the marketplace. If you're disconnected, you can't download items from the Azure Marketplace into your Azure Stack Marketplace. You have to use an external tool, which I'll show you in a little bit how it works, to download the content. So it's just an extra difficult procedure if you're disconnected, not impossible. The patch and update cycle operates in a similar fashion. You have to download the patches, push them into storage on the Azure Stack instance, and then apply them. You will have seen that in the patch and update module. So a few other things, app services, sometimes the web apps try and automatically go out and get a new client. The cloud discovery features of Visual Studio and the ADFS capabilities of Visual Studio will be impaired potentially. Telemetry data for Azure Stack won't be gathered, and any third-party packages in the marketplace that depend on telemetry data won't be able to report them to the internet. Obvious. If you use public PKI certificates, you won't be able to see the CRL that's published on the internet. So there are some procedures that you'd have to take to quieten down any errors or timeouts while Azure Stack is waiting to try and resolve that CRL. So Key Vault, you will have noticed that the Key Vault inside Azure Stack is software only. So a lot of times people will use the Key Vault in public Azure to hold their secrets, which can use an HSM. And in ADFS, you can't do stuff against the Key Vault because the regular identities aren't allowed to. So there's a different experience. The users are going to have to ask an admin to add any new applications into the Key Vault. Obviously, hybrid applications aren't going to work. So anything where you expect to have part of your workload running in Azure Stack and the rest in Azure won't work if you are truly disconnected. If you are internet accessible, you can build them applicable. So in the app service itself, there's some specific things that don't work. So obviously, if you're trying to go out to GitHub or Dropbox or OneDrive, when you're doing continuous integration and deployment, that's not going to work if you can't see those things on the internet. So only CI/CD sources that are available to Azure Stack would work in those cases. Extensions. So if you're disconnected, often the extensions are produced by contributors and the feed that populates the gallery item will be unavailable. And functions, there's some limitations to the way that Azure functions are available in a disconnected scenario. And if you use Kudu for web deployment, again, things like NuGet won't be able to make the calls as the worker roles inside the app service won't be able to reach out to the internet. So what does deployment look like for disconnected Azure Stack? So there might obviously be physical consideration like mobile, ruggedized scale units, etc., about how you're going to get the components of Azure Stack into the place that it's going, if it's truly mobile, as opposed to just a disconnected data center location. The identity provider that you select must be ADFS if you're going to be disconnected. You can provide it offline if the ADFS is not immediately accessible during the deployment time. So this is what you do in that really extreme miniature case that I showed you earlier on. The certificates must be from a PKI that's accessible to the disconnected Azure Stack so that you can see the certificate revocation list. And in many cases, you might not have a full BGP routed network. So you might have to choose to do static routing and provide the static routes that will let the traffic get out the top of Azure Stack through the top of rack switches. So those are the main distinctions for deploying in a disconnected scenario. Now, as you'll know, one of the very first things that you do when you are managing an Azure Stack instance is you go and you get the most recent PowerShell CMDlets for Azure Stack. And those are just available through GitHub. So here's the process that you'll have to follow if you're managing your Azure Stack from a disconnected machine. So that could be a workstation on the disconnected network, or even from things like the hardware lifecycle host built into the Azure Stack. So you're going to install the Azure Stack PowerShell to a connected machine. So you're going to have a laptop that you take and connect to the internet. You might have to enable additional storage features because some of those features are required. They're underpinning the PowerShell. Then you take those packages and you move them to your disconnected workstation. So that might be as simple as disconnecting your internet connected laptop and bringing it over and connecting it to the other network if that's allowed, or you might have to copy them across. And then you're going to install those PowerShell CMDlets on the other workstation. So you'll see a pattern like this in a lot of the disconnected activities. You're going to do some stuff from a location that's connected to the internet, and then you're going to do other stuff from a disconnected location, a disconnected workstation. There's a similar process for registration. You know that one of the first things you have to do once your Azure Stack is already up and connected and running is to register it with Azure. You still need to do this on a disconnected Azure Stack because your Azure Stack needs to be registered to Azure just for billing purposes. So you'll probably be using the once a month capacity-based billing model, but that Azure Stack still has to be registered up to Azure Commerce so that it knows how big the Azure Stack is, and then it can calculate your monthly bill. So there's another similar process to do the registration if you're disconnected. So you got to get the PowerShell registration modules down to your Azure Stack. So you use the process I just showed you previously to get the PowerShell on there. You generate a registration token file. So some commands to generate the token file. You take the token out of your disconnected environment, and then you use it with another command to register with Azure. Azure will pass you back an activation key, and you take the activation key back to Azure Stack and you run a command to activate it. So this is basically a get on the disconnected environment, connect up to Azure, get the activation key, and then take that back to Azure Stack to get it fully registered. Resource providers. You'll know that when you get Azure Stack out of the box, it does not have the app service or the SQL MySQL resource providers installed, and you normally just pull those down from the internet and install them locally on the Azure Stack. Again, the process is a little bit different here. So you would download a copy of the resource provider onto an internet connected computer. You'll bring that copy onto the isolated Azure Stack network. You'll copy it into place, and then you complete the deployment process by running or finishing the installation of the resource provider on your disconnected. So here's what it looks like for the app service resource provider. So this is from your connected workstation. You'll connect up, you'll get the software, and when you run it, it asks you this question right off the bat. Do you want to create an offline package? So you'll select that, you'll create an offline package, and then you will take that offline package into your disconnected environment. And then you'll run it over there and you'll say, hey, I want to complete the offline installation now that I'm on the other side, the disconnected Azure Stack side. So then it will ask you a bunch of questions. It'll say, hey, what's the ARM endpoint of your Azure Stack instance? And this will allow you to connect and finish the installation. So you're going to give it the ID of your subscription and the region that you're. Once the installation is finished, you'll be able to see the resource provider in the operator portal. So here's a little screenshot of what you'd actually see. You'll just look at the overview. You'll find the app service.local resource group, and in there it should say all roles are ready. That means the app service has been officially completely set up. There's a similar process for SQL and MySQL resource provider. So you download the files, you copy them into the disconnected Azure Stack environment. So from a Windows 10 or a Server 2016 virtual machine or higher, make sure you've got all the PowerShell modules and that you've got the right VM images already in your marketplace, because the SQL resource provider needs some images to be ready to deploy the solution on. Make sure you've got all the certificates in a PFX file, and then you run the installer. At the end, you would verify the deployment the same way as you just did with the app resource provider. Again, this is a copy from the internet to deploy in the disconnected environment. So what about considerations? So the certificates must be issued from an internal CA, so somewhere that's going to be accessible to the disconnected Azure Stack. Your Azure Stack must have access to the certificate revocation list, because it's going to go out and check that for a number of things, both for the fabric of Azure Stack and if you need to issue any certificates for your running workloads. And before 1903, we had some limited functionality, which meant that certificates had to be issued from the same internal CA. In 1903 and later, the certificates can be issued from any enterprise CA that's. So identity, we mentioned that you must use Active Directory Federation services, not Azure AD, if you're truly disconnected. And the critical thing here, which we've talked about in some of the earlier sections, are once you choose your identity provider, you cannot switch. Switching identity provider is going to be a full redeployment of Azure Stack. So if you start disconnected and later on you get internet connectivity and you want to switch to Azure AD, no can do. You're going to have to redeploy your whole Azure Stack, which involves the OEM and everything. So essentially, you're going to follow the ADFS identity provider path during the installation. There's a couple of pieces to actually connecting up to an internal environment of Active Directory. So that's the ADFS services and the directory graph service. So there's two channels, two connectivities that go out from the secret hidden internal Active Directory and ADFS that's within the Azure Stack Fabric and the external ADFS. So you just got to make sure that you've got connectivity both through ADFS and through AD Graph to query the external Active Directory. Again, this is standard stuff, nothing unusual about the disconnected scenario here. This is just something to be aware of when you're using ADFS as your identity. So there are a couple of ways to set it up. You can download the federation metadata. So there's a procedure to go and get some data off your Active Directory, your ADFS installation that's sitting on your existing network, and then you just suck it up during the configuration of your Azure Stack. So that doesn't have to be live at the time. So you can follow those links and find out how to do the setup. Two methods to do the same thing, basically. And there's some reasons that you would use option B, which is slightly more complicated, especially if when you deploy, you're not going to have access to the ADFS live, as it were, from your Azure Stack instance. So I talked about graph. So what is graph? Graph is another piece of the identity puzzle. So if you're deploying role-based access control in Azure Stack, the graph component must be configured. It's whenever the role-based access checks are happening, it goes out through the graph connector to the existing on-premises Active Directory and gets resource user information from there. So that uses an LDAP call as opposed to just the regular ADFS identity transition between the internal Active Directory and the ADFS that you're federating with. So as we've said before, that only interacts with a single forest. So there are a few things that you have to do on the existing Active Directory. We've gone over these in the identity module, but just as a quick recap, you have to set up both ADFS. So you're going to set up a relying party from your existing internal ADFS that says, hey, it's okay, I'm going to trust the ADFS connectivity that's coming from Azure Stack. And for the graph configuration, Azure Stack uses a service account. So it uses user and password credentials that are used to read the LDAP on-premises Active Directory. So that just takes a little bit of extra setup. Here are the ports that are required. So they're normal LDAP ports, as if the Azure Stack is an LDAP client and the on-premises Active Directory is an LDAP server. So it's going to be 389 or 636 for LDAP, and then the global catalog queries go over 3268 or 3269. In some environments where you have disconnected Azure Stacks, the users might require smart card logon. So there's nothing specific in Azure Stack to configure smart card logon, but when connections come in, if they use Windows integrated authentication, they'll automatically prompt for alternative authentication forms, including smart card. So the authentication request is going to go through ADFS from Azure Stack out to the connected directory. And that means that ADFS has to be configured to use certificate authentication. There's a global authentication policy that you set up within your ADFS connection, and you must identify certificate authentication there. This can also work with PowerShell. There's a little technique to enable it. So basically, if smart card logon is configured in your environment, it can also be used when users connect up to the Azure Stack. So what about time sync? Azure Stack desires to sync time with all the Fabric VMs and the source server nodes up to a time server. So at a minimum, you should sync your time up to the on-premises Active Directory that you're federating with. If there's another real NTP service that's internet connected and can deliver time services, it makes sense to sync up to that. But that might not be available in all disconnected environments. You might also want to bring marketplace items from public cloud Azure down into Azure Stack. You almost certainly will. So how do you keep it fresh? So there's a tool called the Marketplace Syndication tool. You use it, it's based on PowerShell. You use it to identify the marketplace items that you want to bring into Azure Stack. You do this from a connected machine. You then transfer the items across to your Azure Stack. And then on the Azure Stack environment, those items will appear in the portal. So you can't obviously download them directly from the portal like you could if it was connected. So here are the prerequisites. Your Azure Stack has to be registered with Azure already using that procedure I showed you before. You have to have the PowerShell modules, and then you are able to run the tool. So there's a normal prerequisites to get enough environment ready to. You use add Azure RM account. So this is the account that you use to register with Azure. You get the zip file for the tool itself. So there's the location to get the zip load. You unzip it and you load the tool. It will pop up a user interface like this. You can see all the marketplace items available from public Azure that have been marked as usable in Azure Stack. You select which ones you want. So they could be virtual machine images, they could be extensions, they could be general gallery item files. So you'll pick them and then you can select to download them. You can do all this in PowerShell scripting as well. So if you were going to refresh these every month, you could hack up the script for the marketplace downloader and just tell it to go and get the specific items from the public gallery that you choose every month. So this is all just backed by PowerShell. It's possible to hack it up yourself if you need to. So once you get the items downloaded, you take them to your disconnected environment and you would put them into Azure Stack blob storage. So the tool itself will allow you to download them, and it uses AZ into storage. Once the items are in the storage there, you're going to use the import Azure Stack offline marketplace item CMDlet. You're going to point it to the content. So where is that content available in Azure Stack and the credentials? And then you just point that at your Azure Stack and it will download the current marketplace content into your. So again, this is like the other processes. You do some of it from a machine that's connected to the internet to download the content. You take it across, you put it into storage on Azure Stack, and then you run some commands over there to import it and make it visible in the marketplace. In Azure Stack, we also have the ability to put stuff in the marketplace that's your own content. So we call that side loading. So of course, you can still follow the normal side loading process to put your own VM images, etc., into the marketplace. So it's a similar process. You would copy stuff into a blob storage location on Azure Stack, and then you run the PowerShell CMDlet to point to that blob storage and suck the side-loaded item up into the marketplace. So here's an example. This is an Azure package. So it's a nicely formatted, well-known format to include a bunch of items that define that Azure package. You put it into storage using the regular folder structure, and then you run a PowerShell command to suck that Azure package up into. So here's an example of the actual command. So you can see we point to our Azure Stack, we connect up to it with an Azure Stack admin account, and then you use the add Azure Stack gallery item CMDlet pointed to a particular place in blob storage, and you define what it is you want to suck up. In this case, it's an Azure package. So that will appear in the marketplace. Now, in a connected Azure Stack, you can actually connect to Git from the portal, and you can select some templates to use. So those obviously are not available if your disconnected Azure Stack is not connected to the internet, but you can still use those items. You'll have to go to a connected machine, go to the Git repository that holds these things, and then pull the content down and install it. So what about licensing, billing, and reporting? So if you're truly disconnected, you're not going to connect up even once within 30 days. You have to use the capacity-based billing. That's the flat fee per month based on the size of your Azure Stack. It is possible to switch between capacity and consumption if you later get connected. You have to pay out the current month's bill, and then you'll switch over to pay as you use. And there are two different rates for the capacity-based billing, whether you decide, hey, I'm just going to deploy IaaS, like virtual machines, versus if you're going to use the resource providers and deploy some PaaS services. Now, you can capture actual consumption directly at your Azure Stack. So even though it's not going to appear on your bill, there are still local usage APIs, so you can connect up to your Azure Stack and pull off metering information. So if you want to cross-charge your end users for how much time their workload is using on your Azure Stack, that's still possible. You'll have to query that yourself locally. So this is how the billing normally works. Azure Stack is in that blue box at the bottom there. The consumption of running virtual machines or running PaaS services are collected all the time. And there's a service called the usage bridge that connects up to public Azure, talks to a usage gateway, and registers that consumption in the commerce engine up there. That then makes it onto your bill that comes at the end of the month. However, if you're disconnected, the usage bridge isn't going to find any public Azure to talk to. So you're going to be on the capacity model of billing, where you get a flat fee per month, but you can still query the usage APIs locally at your Azure Stack through PowerShell, through RESTful APIs, etc. So you can develop something to pull your own meters and watch what your user workloads are consuming. Now, backing up is slightly different than normal backup for Azure. As you've seen in the backup deck that we talked through earlier, you have an infrastructure backup, which backs up the fabric information, the configuration about Azure Stack, and puts it into a file share. That file share would have to sit somewhere near your Azure Stack deployment. Ideally, it should be off stack so that if there's a disaster in your rack, you're going to be able to recover from it. So not much different here. You just need to have a UNC path and a shared folder accessible to your disconnected Azure Stack. The user workload backup, again, is similar, although you cannot use some of the tools that you could use with a connected Azure Stack. So we said that agent-based backups are the primary way for backing up running workloads. You can't use Azure Site Recovery because Azure Site Recovery can only recover onto public Azure, which we're assuming is not accessible. And you can't use the Azure Backup Server example that we gave in that other module. It needs to be connected to Azure every 15 days, even if it's only just backing things up locally on disk. So you'd run some other third-party backup tool that has agent-based backup inside the running virtual machine. So here's one of the slides that we had in that other environment. So this is basically just saying you can't have your backup target exist somewhere out on the internet or somewhere inside public Azure. It's got to be something local that's performing those backups. The last little section here is about support. So how do you get support when you're disconnected and different or more difficult? So if you've ever opened a support case and worked with Microsoft for Azure Stack, you'll know that we do some stuff directly online. So the unlocking to get to the powerful commands in the privileged endpoint, that needs a token, and you generate the token on the Azure Stack. You pass it across to Microsoft support. We generate a corresponding token and send it back to you, and only then is that instance of Azure Stack unlocked. So it's a really, really long string. You'd normally just cut and paste it between your Azure Stack environment and Microsoft. Also for log collection, often we might ask you to collect certain logs from an incident from a certain time. You normally would connect up to the Azure Stack blob storage where those logs are stored, copy them, and then send them to Microsoft support. So all those will be either a pain or really, really difficult if you're in a somewhat disconnected environment or a completely disconnected environment. So if you imagine the unlock token, it's like a whole page of characters that's normally copied and pasted. So we've had some customer experiences where someone has had to read out those characters over the telephone to Microsoft, and then Microsoft has had to read out the response code back to the customer because the environment was truly disconnected. Nothing could be copied in and out. The other thing is it's obviously a lot easier to work with support if they can see what's on your screen. If you don't have any screen sharing, that's going to be difficult. Okay, the last thing to talk about here is activation for the user VM. So in Azure, if you create a VM, there's a KMS, a key management server, that does the activation of the VMs all for you automatically behind the scenes. In Azure Stack, we take advantage of a feature that's available in Windows Server called automatic VM activation. Now, only Windows Server 2012 R2 and above understands how AVMA works. So all of those guest VMs will be automatically activated when they're running on top of Azure Stack. If you deploy operating systems earlier than that, you need to have KMS activation or volume activation. So this isn't really something that's specific to Azure Stack, but you need to have an accessible KMS server or a volume activation license in your images to make them activate properly if they're running in a disconnected environment. As of May 2019, AVMA didn't work to activate Windows Server 29, but that's being fixed. It may have already been fixed already. I haven't taken a look recently. And in some cases, a virtual machine may be set up to use some other kind of activation. You can convert it over to AVMA by using the SL Manager command. So you run SL Manager /IPK, and there's a special universal key that says, hey, I want to use AVMA activation. It's possible that your disconnected Azure Stack may get reconnected at some point. So what are the conditions there? So as I said at the start, there's no disconnected setting for Azure Stack. So it's not like you have to move a slider to say, hey, I'm connected. But there are some things that cannot be changed. You can't change the initial IP address range, your public IPs that you picked. So if you connect it somewhere else that you weren't expecting to, that range may not be appropriate for connecting above the TOR switches to the border devices. So that might be a problem for you. Once you are reconnected, you could switch from the capacity billing mode to the consumption-based billing. You can enable marketplace syndication, but as I said several times before, you cannot change your identity provider. So you're going to be stuck with ADFS. And that's all. I hope you've enjoyed this series of Azure Stack presentations from myself and the other presenters. And good luck.